Hello, everybody. We'll wait a minute or two to let people come on. Tristan, are you with us?
I am. I'm here.
Okay, so maybe like 12:32. Do you want to take a roll?
Yeah, definitely.
Tristan, one more favor. Can you grant me permission to share my screen?
Yes. Permission granted.
Thank you.
All right, I'll start our roll call. You will start with Angela.
Hello. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Angela. Sharon, Carol,
Here. Nice to see you.
Dan Schmidt.
Good afternoon. How's everyone?
I think we're doing all pretty good. Thanks for asking. Diane Fladmo,
Hi, everyone. Here.
Christine Egger,
Here. I'm here.
thank you. Sorry, we're having. I'll get through roll call real fast. We've got Dylan Klapmeyer,
I'm here.
Erica Allen,
I am here.
Jewel Walker,
Good afternoon. I'm here.
Nicole Flynn.
Hey, everyone. I'm here. And I apologize. My camera's off. I'm having some computer issues today, so I may be switching over to my phone later.
No worries. Thank you. Nick Schumacher.
Yeah, here from beautiful Southeast Montana.
Wonderful. Mike Perry.
I am back in the lower 48. Good to see everybody.
Philip Corbett.
Hello, present.
Val Fowler.
I'm here. Good afternoon.
Did we do Dean?
Good afternoon from Great Falls.
I think that's everyone.
Thank you, Tristan. And welcome, everybody. Great attendance. Hope everybody had a great week. You ramp up if you're at a school district for school to start sooner rather than later at this point. And we get fast and furious in our everyday world with that soon. So we will continue our discussion of chapter 57. I'm going to rip through the agenda objectives for today. We will review all the normal stuff. We're going to talk about endorsements, which we didn't have a group that focused on endorsements, but we have some bullet points to guide our discussion around obtaining endorsements, some potential barriers that exist with that in the state of Montana currently. Then we're going to look at where we are and what we've discussed so far. So in an effort to have some broad recommendations that Crystal can report to the superintendent at the conclusion of this meeting in terms of areas of focus that this group has talked about, help us move forward into our next steps. And we'll look at our schedule, specifically as we know school is starting and how we might need to adjust, but what we are tasked with doing at this point. So that's what we're going to cover today. I think we're all good with this. Everybody's been here before. Just use the hand if you can, communicate via the chat. If you need to, we do our best job to monitor that. And if you can, please keep your mic on mute. And always be respectful, supportive, present, and open. We are fully aware that everybody is bought into this. We may today, if all things go well, take an actual vote to agree upon the high-level recommendations that we've discussed so far. And to do that, we will take a roll call vote for that. We will need greater than 60% to be able to move forward with those and let those move on to the superintendent. So endorsements. Let's talk about endorsements after Sharon talks.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions from last week. I felt like I kind of ran out of time and I didn't really want to interrupt anybody. So this is with regard to Deputy Superintendent Allen's statement about the praxis last week. She made a brief statement about that there is evidence that the praxis is ineffective. And then I didn't get a chance to ask her a question because I think she logged in and logged out really quickly. So I might be a little bit confused about our role here if we're actually really ready to clarify, to solidify some recommendations, especially about that item to the superintendent at the end of this meeting. I guess what I'd like to see then, and maybe I'm a little bit confused about our role here, but I guess I'd like to see more evidence about that praxis in effectiveness, because I'm not sure that I had a chance to actually see where that study came from. So that was my big question about after last week's session.
So I do not know what specific study Assistant Superintendent Allen was referencing. Crystal, maybe we can put that on our to-do to pass along and ask her if she can provide that. But I skipped ahead to the end, Sharon. When I say high-level recommendations, really what I'm saying is that what we would put forward is, we talked about the praxis for initial license, and the group would like to discuss keeping or removing it. That's currently what the recommendation is. Nothing,
Okay.
nothing specific outside of,
Okay.
we think this is an area where we should focus and have additional discussion about it.
Certainly.
So we're not moving into like get rid of it or change it
Okay.
to this point. Just that, yeah, it's a thing, and we should discuss more about that.
Absolutely. Understood.
So I can say that along those lines, while we're here, there are studies that exist that do not show a strong correlation between praxis score and teacher effectiveness. But that doesn't mean it's not useful necessarily. I think it depends on what sort of study you're looking at, and would not necessarily, it depends on what group you look at as to what the recommendation is in terms of keeping it or not keeping it. So, Philip.
Yeah, I just, if you could go back to your last slide, please, Mr. Williams. I thought our focus here was on reciprocity. So when I look at that, in-state teachers keep or remove it, I didn't think there was a lot of, well, maybe there was, but as far as, like I had mentioned last week, as long as that's with what we would assume as a teacher preparation program, I think it has a place. I thought our focus was on those folks coming out of state that already have experience. Do we need to require, basically that, burden of, oh, we're going to give you a class 5A because you're going to have to wait a year, or you have a year to take this praxis, which they have probably taken already from their previous state.
So you are correct. What, if you see, just look above, what I captured in collaboration with Crystal and Eric from the conversation last week was that there was there was a discussion that was more clear than not among the group that the praxis requirement for out-of-state applicants who had previously obtained a license may not be a necessity, but there was no clarity around in-state, especially in light of Superintendent Allen's comment as to whether it was useful or not. So that's sort of like why it's keep or remove, question mark, more discussion to be had around that. Because I did not feel that we discussed that at all, that the group who talked about assessments, their recommendation was to keep it for initial license, but we really didn't have a chance to dig into that discussion. So when we get to this point, Philip,
Thank you.
if we feel like that's not something we even want to bring up, then we just decide not to bring it forward. Diane.
I just have a question on the praxis even for initial licensure. And I'm specifically wondering about the effectiveness of the practice in terms of our Native American potential candidates. And are there particular studies that show specifically that category of licensees or potential licensees, and if that is more of a barrier than a help, or is it legitimate for that group? I just would like us to look a little deeper into different areas if we could, and different types of licensees.
So Julie Mergel had mentioned last week that they had requested, I think, pass rate data from Praxis. To her knowledge, last week, I don't think she knew if she got that yet. And that was one reason why Montana was not included in the report that was referenced. Angela has unmuted. Angela, do you have knowledge of that at all, pass rate for students who are Native American?
The NEA did a study a while ago, and it's out there, and it does point to disparate outcomes on the praxis for African Americans and other people of color. I will see if I can't find that study.
Thanks.
Any other comments on this, knowing that we will come back to it again in this meeting as well, but doesn't mean we can't discuss it now. Sharon.
Yeah, I like the idea of coming back to this again. I think that our praxis requirement for initial licensure has a place, and I think it has a strong place in our teacher preparation programs. Is that where they're at right now? And those folks from Montana State or from the Montana University system can maybe answer that later, or just be prepared to answer that later. But that's certainly one of my questions, is that where is it right now in our teacher preparation programs?
Can I speak on this?
Please do.
Go ahead, Karina. I don't agree that it should have a place in, and only because I have really mixed messages on the praxis itself, and it does not decide if a teacher's is good or not. And so to keep them from ever teaching because they don't have the praxis requirement is, I don't agree with it.
So to answer, this is Julie. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm just in a corner of a hotel here. So the requirements for the in-state preparation programs for the 10 that Sharon was asking about is part of, and it is built within their education prep program into what they call the MAC, which is a 10-point system. And the praxis is one component of that, as well as their GPA and as well as their kind of scores that they get in their student teaching. So it is built within the education preparation program. And so you have to get a certain score on that to get some points in order to then pass for that body of evidence within the MAC. For out-of-state people, they take the praxis. And so that's a separate requirement for out-of-state. In terms of the passing scores and the tests that they take based upon the endorsement area are the same for both out-of-state and in-state. I am working on getting that data for you guys in terms of the praxis results, because we talked about that last week. I'm not sure if it's to the level that maybe would be helpful for what Diane is asking, and maybe to also share kind of what Karina is alluding to, if you will. But I'm working on getting that data for you guys. In terms of how desegregated it is, I may need to look a little bit deeper.
John, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Julie said a lot of the same things I was going to say. We do offer, or we do require the praxis. It's not actually part of our program. It is a licensure requirement. And so we have students who can actually complete our program, graduate, get their degree, but they can't get their license until they pass the praxis. And so we have it built into the program. We want them to do it before student teaching, ideally pass it before they student teach. But the requirement is a requirement of OPI for license. It's not one of our requirements for graduation. So it's an interesting wicket there. I think one of the things that we were talking about last week is actually that MAC as a whole. I brought up that is part of the highly qualified system, and we're no longer under highly qualified. So is there a way through the licensing committee that we could look at how we recommend people? Going back to that focus groups that you did, some of the things that came out of there is that the person's ability to be a successful teacher is more important than this multiple measures of content knowledge. And so are there some different ways maybe that we could look at what we do with folks to show that they're ready to go into the teaching profession? And if it's the praxis, we keep offering the praxis. If there's something different that we could offer, maybe there's something different, but really looking at how we recommend people from our programs who are going into teaching that they're ready to be teachers, not necessarily that they can pass the praxis. And so that's kind of where that conversation was last week. And Sharon, I don't know if that answers your question, but what kind of the best I've got at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Additional conversation. We will come back to it, I promise. Dan.
All right, so what we just heard then is that the praxis is only an OPI requirement to satisfy the ARM, and the university system doesn't even use the data from the praxis as a part of their period. So with that being said, this really does just lie with how it applies to licensing and nothing else. Is that the total sum of that whole situation?
John, can you confirm that? That is what I heard you say.
We do use the praxis as a measure of content, but it's not one of our program requirements. So we use it, we look at the data, we study it, we see how are people doing in those content areas compared to that exam. But it's a requirement from the state, not a requirement from the university.
But a candidate does not need to pass the praxis to obtain their degree and complete your program.
That is correct.
So this is a call that I had actually with Julie last week about a candidate who had completed a degree program but has not passed the praxis and is trying to work through a campus to try and get a class 5, but needs the recommendation of the campus to do so. So Julie, do you want to elaborate on our conversation a little bit from last week?
Sure. And so what you guys are talking about now is kind of the university recommendation. And so in order to get a class 5 provisional license, you need to have a plan of study, if you will. And then you have to meet, the background checks and all of the requirements. You can get a 5A, which is a 1-year license, provisional license, if you meet all of the requirements except for have not passed the praxis. And so we had a candidate who does want to apply for a provisional and get the 5A to have that 1 year to pass that praxis, but it's requiring that the university sign off on the university recommendation that they met the requirements for the endorsement for the program.
Erica, you have your hand up.
It just, it is in looking at bringing teachers in from out of state, is there anything individual in the praxis that is state specific, that we're looking for specific information? And are there other ways that we can assess whether they have that knowledge, whether people in state or out of state? Are there other assessments that other states are using that we could also use?
So the answer to your first question is no, there's nothing state specific about the praxis. And the discussion here would be teachers who are coming from other states with an active license, then they would have passed whatever the requirements, whether they be testing or not testing in the state where they're coming from to obtain that license. I think the key indicator is, do they have a license or not?
And why would it be any different for the state versus for out of state versus in state? The bottom line is I don't believe the dictator of Mongolia needs to be a part of the praxis requirement, whether or not they're a good teacher or not. That's just an example.
So to answer the question about out-of-state candidates, regardless if you have a license in another state, you still have to take the praxis, and that's the only exam that currently is available to meet that licensure requirement.
Why do you need that exam is what I guess what I'm asking. Why do we need that?
So just specific to out of state, I think last week's discussion, the determination was it wasn't necessary for out of state teachers. The discussion was not had, which we're sort of having now around in-state as to whether or not it's necessary or not. Christine.
Our group did the assessments and found that I believe 41 states have a praxis or another test that they require for their teachers to get their certification in their programs at the college level. So it's redundant for us to have them take it again or the praxis versus their similar test they just took with the reciprocity.
So if I could add something to, I think this whole conversation and all of these recommendations, we have 4 bullet points here as high level recommendations. And I guess the way that I and maybe a few others on this committee perhaps have been looking at what you have here, which are clearly items that continue to emanate out of several of our conversations. And even today, there's a lot of interest in moving some of these pieces forward, but they are parts of other pieces of what we might address within the chapter. And as a standalone item, or even, grouped as a 4, for me, they may not paint the whole picture of how we get to where we want to go with ensuring flexibility and how we get the teachers to where we want them to go and how do we get them to stay there. And so I guess what I would also add to this list is maybe 2 steps. And one would be perhaps that some work is done, research is done on the tiered licensure piece. and what is happening and its impact in the places where it has been employed across the country, and perhaps a presentation made to this group in the coming weeks so that we can consider that with all of this. And then once that would happen, perhaps I would recommend that that a committee of this group be assigned to start to draft language around that. If there is interest, that would embody all 4 of these bullet points, but also perhaps consider that tiered licensure piece, because what we have here, I think, is 4 pieces of something that is of that even together cannot be considered, I think, as part of the whole of what needs to be considered and done. For example, I think what we do with the 5-year experience and whether we reduce that or eliminate that, that's going to depend on what we do with other areas of Chapter 57. And I think that might be the case for other folks on here, and I'd love to hear more about that. But just quickly, my recommendations would be, we need to have a presentation on what that tiered licensure looks like. We need to hear some information, some results of research done in some of those states. And then if there is interest in taking a look at that and changing some language that would include these folks, these bullet points, then maybe we attach a subcommittee to do that work, and we go after it and then present those as maybe overall recommendations. But I think we're getting pieces and parts here and maybe not the whole, and I don't know if that's in the best interest of our overall efforts at flexibility and in really trying to drive teachers to where we need them and get them to stay.
Sean, you have your hand up?
Yeah, hi. How's everybody doing today? I was just going to take a look and when we were considering the 3 and 5 years on the second bullet point, for instance, on the out-of-state teachers, and I just wanted to come back to that just for a second. You know, I started asking around, and my relatives, brother-in-law, sister, and niece are all graduates from the education programs in Montana, and they've all fled the state. And my niece most recently, this last year, with no teaching experience, she has successfully passed the art praxis and will be teaching first year in Alaska this coming year. So I'm not sure, you know, if we need to have some further consideration around whether there's 5 years of experience, 3 years of experience, or simply passing the praxis or some other similar test in order to bring these people in from out of state. Obviously, other states are doing the same, are bringing people in, bringing teachers in who have no teaching experience but have passed the praxis. And I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Sean. Go ahead, Diane.
Thank you. This is an area that I'm real interested in as well. So I would like to see more information on, and I know we have the reciprocity study. I'd like to be able to review that more in depth as a part of the committee if I could. If I'm not sure how exactly we'll do that, but I'd be interested in looking at that. And I am particularly interested in what we can do as a representative for teachers, what we can do to work to retain our teachers once they go to a district and sign on and move, how we can support them more. So that's an area of interest I have that might make me interested in reducing what we require before they come.
So I'm going to derail us a bit here and ask Angela, you've talked multiple times about the consideration of that support aspect for teachers. Can you clarify that? Is your vision that fits within the tiered system, and so the tiered system exists, and then outside of the chapter, understood within this tiered system as that's happening, there is support simultaneously happening for the teachers, or is there some mandated piece of support that's actually in the chapter itself?
So I think I really appreciate your request there. I think it gives me a real good opportunity. So Okay, I just got muted. That's okay. I think we have a real opportunity here, and I think Diane hit the nail on the head in retaining our teachers. And so Sean said it so well. I mean, really, we need to address what we're going to do to draw people to our state, simplify this process, maintain quality at the same time, but really make it ensure flexibility. And so how can we do that? While also driving folks to some of these areas where they're needed the most and then keep them there. And so to your question, Jacob, I think we have a real opportunity, whether it is with pre-service teachers who are just short of completing, or whether it is with out-of-state teachers who want to come to Montana. And right now we have this 5 years of experience, which right now demonstrates to all of us in our school districts and in the Office of Public Instruction that they've attained experience and competence, etc. And we're suggesting maybe that we move away from that. Then we talk even about our brand new licensees who are fresh graduates of our EPPs. I think we have a real opportunity to provide the first license in Montana that would allow them the chance to teach in Montana, whether we have the praxis or whatever, but it would allow them the chance to teach in Montana, but it would also at the same time require them to work with their district or with an EPP to ensure that they have at least 2 years, and this is just what I'm rattling around in my head and thinking about what could work. Make sure that they have at least 2 years of a mentorship program, so that if we're going to open the doors for an out-of-state teacher to come to Montana without any experience that can be verified, we're going to make sure then that we get them into one of our areas, perhaps where they're needed the most, and then we support them in staying there, and that is verified through their district and through the Office of Public Instruction, that they have that plan in place. And we could do that with our pre-service, who are doing something like maybe an advanced student teaching model for a year, where they're working in a district, but also as they're getting district support, and they've been hired by the district, but they're getting district support, EPP support as they complete their process. We can do that with a teacher coming in from out of state, verify that they're getting that mentorship support, and also drive them perhaps through this licensing mechanism to say, okay, if you take a job at a high needs area, stay there for 2 years. After the second year of staying there, plus a mentorship program, you can move into a full license. And I think that we could do that with all of ours, but mandate that mentorship. And I do know that there is that mandate out there for districts to provide that. However, I think in addition to whatever may be happening at the district, I know for a fact that MSU is really creating an innovative model right now for their Rural Teachers Project, and it's a 2-year post-bac mentorship that they can do pretty soon on the hub. And I believe, and I hope I'm not mistaken, I believe that their intent is at some point to open that up for folks. And it doesn't have to be just for folks who are graduates of their Rural Teacher Project. It could be folks who are graduates of other programs, and it doesn't just have to be the MSU platform. But I think there's some real opportunities for us to use this license and be very prescriptive that if a new teacher comes into out of state, let's get them where we need them. And if they come into out of state, in from out of state without experience, and they go to a school that's on the quality critical educator shortage list, and they stay there for 2 years, and we provide mentorship for them 2 years, folks might be willing to say, okay, maybe we can do that in exchange for some of those years of experience. But let's not just open the gates and say you can come in, and you can come in with only 3 years or less, without making sure that we're using this chapter to say, come to Montana, we've got a job for you in some of these high needs districts, but we're going to expect you to take it with the pledge that you're going to participate actively in this mentorship program, and then sign off on it along with your supervisor at the end, so that you can move into a full license. And so that is a long story, kind of a long explanation, but I think that that's perhaps what we could do here. But it involves consideration of that tiered structure, along with what we would do with all of these pieces that you have outlined here. It might look different too for a spouse, a military spouse. I mean, there may be a different track there too for military spouses. whose families and spouse are so honorably serving our country. I think there's some real opportunities for us to do something magical in getting folks where they're needed and keeping them there with this licensure piece. And I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I've just kind of outlined where I think some of the possibilities are.
Yeah, thank you, Angela, for that clarification. Some nuance there, though, because then, like, when we're thinking about this 5 to 3 years, that's specific to teachers from out of state who went through alternative programs, right? So it's clear that we all understand an out of state teacher who comes with a license, who can demonstrate a past praxis test, they get a license in Montana, more or less, right? Like, that's a relatively clear path. And so then that ties into the praxis issue. So, and then the 6 credit hours, again, that conversation is specific to someone who comes from out of state who has had a lapsed license in the past 5 years. Then they need to do the 6 credit hours. So those are, those 2 bullet points are around some relatively specific cases, but certainly Angela's talking about what I hear you saying, Angela, in that conversation is we need to think about what are those cases who may come from out of state who would then enter into the support program versus having to have these requirements of years, or what does it look like? Really, we don't know. But there's some group of people who are coming from out of state who might think about having the support program built in.
Angela, this is Julie. Just a question about that, Jacob. So when I'm thinking about this is, so when you look at the first bullet, right? That's somebody with a license that has expired. And we're saying you got to go back to school. When I look at the second item, and I see there that somebody's gone through an alternative program and they don't have 5 years of experience. If they have anything less than 5 years experience, the only way they can come to Montana is to go back to school. And so are you suggesting, Angela, in your model that there could be other ways that folks can demonstrate gaining the knowledge or the skills to move from a provisional to a standard teaching license or a professional license in other ways than just going back to formalized school? Like the top bullet, well, maybe there's other things they do in participating in PD or mentorship, but it doesn't require them to actually go back and get university credit. And I did have one question based on some of the chats that are showing up in the praxis. So that's my first question to Angela. And maybe I should pause there and let her answer, but here's the second question. I'm hearing a couple of things around bullet number 3. Is the intention there to remove the praxis requirement for only out-of-state applicants who hold another license somewhere else? Or is part of the conversation to remove the praxis for all people in state and out of state? Because I heard that's kind of what Karina was alluding to. And so I just didn't know if that is completely fleshed out, because there's some questions in the chat about, is it something, the praxis at the university level that they only use to enter into an educator prep program, but not necessarily as a result to leading to their licensure. So I'm going to be quiet. 2 key questions.
So it's important to note our first row here of bullets is specific to teachers who are coming from out of state. So that bullet is specific to those coming from out of state who have an out of state license that is in good standing. The recommendation last week was to remove the additional praxis requirement for that. The second row around the in-state teachers.
But that's only for teachers who have another license.
Correct.
If you're coming from out of state and you don't have a license and you just graduated from a program, it's saying that you still would be required to take the praxis.
Well, that gets to that initial license piece, right? They wouldn't have a license yet. So it'd be their initial license, which is sort of the in-state teacher, kind of falls in that umbrella. We did not get a chance to have that conversation. Angela, I think Julie asked you some questions. Sorry, I interrupted.
Okay, so I didn't know if you wanted me to answer the question about the praxis. I think that we've talked about both, or maybe there's even more than 2 out there now, models of what we could do with that. And I think that it's an if then this kind of a conversation. I think that is what it would look like for me. If we could do this on this end, then we might consider doing this for out-of-state applicants who have previously obtained a license but want to come teach in Montana. So I mean, I just think that there might be different circumstances that might lend themselves to, you know, what a committee might consider would be a reasonable step to get back to what you started with initially, Julie, is licensing someone from out of state and putting them in a classroom and providing them the support that they need to support students in that school and in that community. So I think there's just a number of different models and scenarios that could play out with any of these items that you have up here. But I think it would really depend on what the committee's threshold would be, where their interest would be. But I think that there's a real opportunity for us to consider each of these pieces and what those situations might shake out to look like. And also consider what we're hearing from this group as real or perceived barriers to getting those folks in their schools where they're needed.
Sharon, and then we'll come to you, Sean.
Thank you. And I guess I'd like to address a little bit of what I've been hearing a lot about continued support. And I'm talking to you from a very isolated southeastern Montana school in Ekalaka, knowing that we've often been promised support from the Office of Public Instruction and from the university system with regard to internships. And rarely does it actually happen in person where we really need that. So while I completely support what I'm hearing about perhaps a tiered licensure system, which by the way, it seems like a tiered licensure is already sort of built in when we have this 5A and the if-thens that Angela was talking about. And I completely agree with the support folks need if they don't pass the praxis or the support that they need during this mentoring time. We don't really see that in our rural schools. And it's the rural schools, I think, that keep coming up as needing the help for retention here. So I think that we would all enjoy having that support. And I think as somebody on this committee, I'd enjoy hearing before we make a recommendation like that, what's our capacity to provide that?
And if I could just speak, I don't think I was answering Jacob's question. And I guess the recommendation I think would really have to be something that a subcommittee of this group would have to sit down and come together on and address so much of what we've heard. But I think would have to be after too, we had heard more data, more research about the tiered licensure structures in other states. But I was asked to kind of reflect on what that could look like. And then I guess just to your point about the in-person mentorship, I mean, we know we have that component in rural where it should be happening. And then sometimes that's a capacity concern, et cetera. And that's why I mentioned what MSU is doing online, not always perfect, but sometimes for rural, it's what we can do. And perhaps other strategies could emerge. And Dan mentioned the RISAs, which are another great tool. But where I think there's a will, there's a way. What I do know is that we have an opportunity here, I think, and the more I hear from the conversation, to do something different with Chapter 57 that will get folks to where they're needed and provide a tool that will support them there. And that would be my recommendation, if we could have the committee hear more about the tiered licenses and then determine if there's interest in further in a group sitting down and saying, here's what we could do with our licensure structure, and then bring it back to the group. And also consider these 4 pieces as a part of it.
So Sean, and then after Sean, Karina, I see that you want to speak. So Karina after Sean. Turn.
Hey, Angela, I really like the direction that you're thinking on that. I think that's really useful, and I think it's really valuable. You know, and the next point around this, so I've got 3 points. The first was just that around the direction that Angela is thinking on this, and I'm in full agreement. You know, and I think these points, this conversation is not only around retention of teachers in rural schools, but also for the recruitment of teachers in rural schools and larger schools. So I think these are all very, very valuable points. Now, and I think finally, we see a screen here that just simply says out-of-state teachers, and then we keep hearing about but this first bullet is only for this group, and this third bullet is only for another group. And I would like to see more clarification around which particular groups these particular bullet points are referenced to, because it becomes a little bit confusing in considering one bullet and then a second and a third bullet around different groups. Maybe I'm just confused. I'm confused most of the time, but this certainly doesn't. The structure of this certainly doesn't help me understand which particular group, which particular bullet point is directed toward. So I would just hope for some clarity around that, or some re-editing or something like that, right?
So Sean, when you were talking about grouping, I was also thinking about some kinds of grouping, right? In licensure, our goal is to get them licensed. And what happens after that, right? In terms of the retention or the growth or the development of someone, that really, or even if they get a job, that's no longer a licensure function, right? And so when I'm thinking about licensure function, I'm seeing it really in a couple of categories, right? I see it as you get your initial license, which is you're certified to do whatever to teach in whatever area. Then there's the ongoing renewal to keep your license active. And then the third category is you may enhance your license, meaning go from a provisional to a standard, or a standard to a professional, which is kind of how Montana is tiered, if you will, right? But within that, when we're talking about the multiple pathways, we're saying, what are the different multiple pathways that someone could show competency to become licensed? Then the second would be to keep their license active or ongoing. What do they got to show? And then the third is around what would you need to show to enhance your license to move from, for example, standard to professional. And so I'm thinking about these three categories because as I hear Angela talking about, she's bringing in something in addition to that. She's talking about, and that's what I'm not clear on, Angela, if it's mentorship as a pathway beyond a test or schooling or experience, but it's mentorship with experience that could lead to enhancing your license from a provisional to a standard, or keeping your license active instead of taking 60 renewal units. I guess that's where I'm confused. So as Sean's talking about categories, I was kind of thinking not just in out-of-state teachers or in-state teachers, but also around what are the functions of licensure in those categories? Because kind of how the system is currently set up, it's not to really do much beyond provide the certificate.
Right.
Angela, before you go, let's let Karina speak if she's available, please. She's been waiting.
The only thing I want to say is I agree that in rural schools, in our smaller schools, it is a teacher retention, huge teacher retention problem. I also want to reiterate that it is also that way on our reservation schools. We have a continued problem with retaining teachers, and it goes, and some of it I do believe has a direct result because of the praxis.
Go ahead, Angela, and then we'll come back to you, Sean.
Thank you, Julie. That helps. And I'm sorry if I missed the mark on my first long answer. I think we have a real opportunity to do both. Bring a teacher in from out of state, put them to work in a district where they're needed, and then support them. And so we know that once we give them a license, right, that they have X number of years to meet certain expectations. And what I am saying is build into that X number of, into those expectations, some prescriptiveness. And what I alluded to was the prescriptive nature of 2 years of induction and mentoring support, that they would have the district where they've gotten their new job sign on and verify that it's about to happen. Then when they've concluded it, before they can advance in their licensure, it is verified that they have concluded it. So I think, to answer your question, I think I'd like to see us do both. And I don't know if it necessarily has to be just that mentoring piece. I mean, I think that's too, again, what I would love to delve into with maybe a subcommittee of this work. I think that there's a lot of opportunities for us to consider what would work for Karina's district, what would work for Sean, what would work for Christine. I mean, to really think about packaging those first expectations if a teacher comes in from out of state, what that would look like, or packaging those expectations as far as coursework and mentorship and what those would look like for a pre-service teacher who is advancing their model into the classroom and taking a job and filling a need there. I think that there's a lot of ways that we can go, but to your point, I think we can do both. Get them the license, but it has to be based on proof of A, B, and C. And then they don't advance if those haven't been delivered on. And you know, I think that there's some real opportunities there.
Go ahead, Sean, and then Diane will come to you after Sean.
Yeah, and quickly, just back to kind of the last point I was trying to make around this, and Julie, thank you very much for some clarification around that. In one of the early sessions that we had, we spoke to flow charting, for instance, or understanding the barriers around the different steps to get different kinds, around the different kinds of licensing. So I think I'll go back to this point again, rather than just throwing 4 bullet items out on an out-of-state topic issue. I think it'd be really valuable to actually more deeply analyze the processes that are involved in what potential teachers need to step through in order to be able to achieve certain kinds of licensure. It doesn't do me a lot of good just to see 4 bullets on the screen, because there are different alternatives or different pathways, I should say, to get to those points for different kinds of licensure. So that would be really helpful for me to better understand the whole overall situation through, and again, through an analysis or a flow chart in that kind of way. Thank you.
Go ahead, Diane.
Thanks. I hear a lot of us, and I think we're saying the same thing. I think we all want to try to figure out a way where we can have quality teachers with some flexibility, but also without having the issue that we've seen perhaps in some of our rural districts or other districts where things are started and promised and not delivered. If in my mind, if we want to loosen up what we're doing to bring in the quality teacher that we need for our classroom, I'd like to look at some models where other states perhaps have been successful in other rural states and have been successful in doing a tiered licensure where there are certain requirements that come into play, and they've been provided and they've worked. Before we move along, I'd like to hear more about that. I'd also like to hear more about MSU's program that they're doing. So I guess my bottom line is I'm really open to the possibility. I want it to be feasible for Montana, and I'd like to look more deeply into it.
Thank you, Diane. Any additional conversation around this point?
This is Julie. I was wondering, and I don't know if Karina's still there. Just a clarifying question. She said, the praxis can be a challenge. And so I didn't know, Karina, if you were thinking of it in 2 ways, right? It's a barrier for them to even get to licensure, but it sounds like it could be potentially an and there. It's also a barrier of if they're given a provisional license of a 5A and then they don't pass it within that year, then they can't have the license. And so I didn't know if it was both that you were alluding to from the praxis, or one or the other.
Karina, you're muted, sorry.
Sorry, I would say both, but we've had some awesome teachers that just couldn't pass the praxis. Majority of them, come. It just depends on their experience, where they grew up, and that has a lot to play in it, I believe. In it. At some point, a lot of our Indigenous teachers, some of them have problems, but other people do as well, you know, and some just take tests different. I never believe that tests show what a good teacher is or isn't. I think what they do in the classroom and how they teach students, engage students in their learning is a whole lot more effective than a test. But that's my own personal view. But it has been that's why we have lost teachers.
So we flipped our meeting, but I hear from this conversation I'll put before the group that we're not ready to send any of this outside of this meeting, outside of the fact of maybe a report that we are looking at licensure path, continue to look at licensure pathways, want to look deeper. And we've really identified some different types of buckets that we're looking at. There's the initial license. There's maintaining a license, as Julie said. There's potentially advancing your license. And then there's this sort of the other bucket that I don't think you mentioned, Julie, which is the out-of-state teacher. And within that, there's some different categories that we could have, but we're thinking about those buckets in terms of breaking down barriers.
And Jacob, I just want to throw one thing out there about the pathways, and I don't know, I'm throwing a lot in today, you guys, I'm sorry. Why are we even distinguishing between out-of-state and in-state? Does it really matter? I just have to say that for a minute. It just feels a little weird to me. That's all.
Julie, let me.
There's a pathway, isn't there a pathway?
Yeah, thank you. And that's what I guess I was alluding to with my question in the chat. I am an out-of-state teacher. You know, I came from 2 different states, and I'm just not understanding why it has to be different for in-state or out-of-state. Shouldn't in-state teachers also receive some sort of mentorship? I guess I'm not understanding, and it's just creating more barriers and also more work for the licensure specialists to have all these different pathways. If it could be more consistent in-state and out-of-state, I think that would make a lot more sense. So I just wanted to follow up with that as well. Thank you.
Mike, you have your hand up.
Well, just in regards to Julie's question, for instance, when we were talking about assessment, when we were talking about out of state, in-state, it was just regards to the praxis, where if a teacher came in and had a license from, say, Idaho and hadn't taken the praxis in the last 5 years, we didn't care. So, I mean, that was where we talked about an in-state versus an out-of-state, in particular, only talking about the praxis. So that's kind of where that came up. I don't know if that's what you were talking about with in-state, out-of-state, but that's where we had brought it up in the assessment part.
Thank you, Mike.
So Jacob, you said initial versus not initial, right? And so does it really matter if it's out of state and in state, right? Because you guys, we've got all these different categories. So it's initial versus experienced, out of state versus in state, and it's also traditional pathway versus alternative. So in some ways, to simplify the process, shouldn't it be, what are the criteria that you need to demonstrate to be certified? And then how do you show that competency? And are there multiple ways to show it? Is it because if it's the test, then it should be the test for everybody, regardless of traditional, alternative, in-state, out-of-state. I just feel like there's all these different categories that are currently in the system, and there could be some ways to really simplify it, to just say, what is it that the requirements are? Everybody needs to meet A, B, and C, and these are the pathways that you can meet A, B, and C.
Dan, go ahead.
All right, yes. So Julie, I think we could eliminate those 3 of them right now. just by combining the in-state and out-of-state into one category. Just make it licensure, no matter what it is. I mean, I think we'd be better off, and we'd save, your headaches and the division's headaches for licensure if it was all simpler. And the fact that the traditional pathway versus non-traditional pathway, that is a question that just needs to go. It just needs to be licensure pathway, as we've learned in the last year specifically. I think just simplifying it to a way and eliminating some of this red tape. Now I know, there may have been issues in the past with things, but I think that's also something where you count on, with your schools that have to hire someone who is non-traditional in gaining licensure, to maybe fulfill a little bit more. I mean, that's something I would gladly do in order to make sure that I had a teacher in a classroom and who was qualified by working with that person throughout an entire year or two. So, I mean, I understand all the different issues that currently exist, but I sure would love to see all that shrink at least by half.
Go ahead, Chair.
Well, I guess I'll be the one that disagrees there in part. I think there's been a lot of talk, I guess, about I'm hearing that again about local control. And whether that's in-state or out-of-state is something that we do need to continue talking about, but local control looks very different in every district, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. In fact, we wouldn't even have a state licensing bureau. Some states in times of need have actually allowed their own districts to license their own teachers. And I think it bears looking at screening candidates in an appropriate way to make certain that all of our schools have the same high quality teachers that they would expect from a state licensing bureau. Our school does hire teachers at the very last minute. We do hire administrators and counselors who haven't quite met everything yet. Our local will never blame themselves for hiring a person who is not highly qualified. They'll blame the state licensing bureau for that. So I think it is incumbent upon us as having been on this committee to take a careful look at, and I know that there's a lot of conversation about streamlining and making everything faster and getting teachers in the classroom from out of state and from in-state as quickly as we can. But as a teacher who taught for a long time in a small district with all sorts of folks from all places, we're in Montana, in eastern Montana, so we had teachers from everywhere come here. And we've had all kinds of degrees of success with that, but I do think that our local district looks to this licensing bureau to have quality teachers here, and that streamlining that, I guess I'm misunderstanding maybe our intent of this. Is our intent really to get people in licensed as quickly as we can? Or is it that we need to be very careful and make sure that they're quality candidates as quickly as we can? So thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
I guess I could follow up a little bit with that, Sharon. And I don't think it's just to expect, just to get teachers in and not make sure that they're quality. But I can tell you that being the licensure director, I'm in charge of all emergency authorizations. And in just this past week, I've gotten 15 and asking for the quick turnaround. So I think it's trying to find the right mix to say, making sure that we're getting quality teachers and we're getting the right candidates in, but also, wouldn't we rather a pathway for teachers that, as we're talking in state, out of state, rather than just getting an emergency license for somebody that's not even necessarily qualified for the position. So I think that it kind of can be both. I absolutely do not want to take away from it being a quality candidate. It's not just, us shipping them a license and saying, well, it's a body in a classroom. I don't think anybody wants that. However, I can tell you that we're only seeing more and more emergency authorizations coming in, and especially in areas that maybe they shouldn't be. So it's a real concern, and I think it's just trying to figure out the right mixture, so to speak. So I appreciate that input, but I do want to say I think that it can do both.
So I'll add just a minute that too, Crystal, that maybe help ground us in that. I would make a strong argument you will not solve the teacher retention or recruitment issue through licensing arm. You can potentially improve it, right? It is a single variable in a large, difficult equation that adds up. So that's that balance piece that Crystal's thinking about, right? Is making sure we're keeping that balance. Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I agree with Crystal and what she's speaking to. And in my mind, what when we're talking about licensure, in my mind, what we're here for is to try to provide the maximum flexibility, in the vetting and the hiring process, while continuing to provide a structure that maintains quality candidates. So developing licensure, whether that's in-state or out of state or just licensure, that seems to be the goal to me around this process. Thank you.
John.
I just wanted to follow up quick on Crystal's comment. I know it's probably not the place of this committee, but it seems like if we really wanted to impact some of the licensing obstacles, perhaps recommending that we fully fund and staff Crystal's unit so that they can actually turn licenses around. That would be a fantastic argument. I think that this committee, even if it's not an official recommendation, I don't know how many licenses Lori and Becky process because I'm not in that office, but I know how many we send them on a regular basis. And they do a lot of work for two people. And perhaps there may be a way that we could suggest that maybe they look at allocations and perhaps they need to hire one or two more people to come in and help process those licenses as well. No matter what processes we change, if we continue to add more work to people that are doing their best to keep up with the work that's there, but can't keep up, we just make the problem even worse. And then I really liked what Julie was talking about with the out-of-state versus in-state and not creating two different structures of licensure, that we have one structure of licensure. So just wanted to put a plug in for Crystal and her crew. They're doing good work with limited resources, and whatever we can do to help get them a little bit more, I think we should do it.
Go ahead, Diane, you have your hand up.
I'll be brief. I think John is right. I know during the legislative session, there was a 12% vacancy at OPI. And I know it's difficult to get workers in many, many places, but given that we have a real important need to get folks licensed quickly and meet the requirements or notified that they don't, I think that would be a message that I would appreciate us sending as a group, so that make that a priority. And I don't know if there is a vacancy in this department or not. And I know we're treading into an area that might be a little different, but I think it's an important one.
Jewel, go ahead.
Thank you. I agree with everything that has been said. I think that should be our number one recommendation. And it could be submitted quickly as to assistance for them in helping process all of the applications.
So yes and yes, you guys, right? Like we definitely, there is the demand of the job, right? And certainly could use more people. And I would say also, you guys, though, regardless if we had 10 licensure specialists instead of 2, some of these issues are providing some barriers to getting qualified applicants in. There are qualified teachers, for example, that might have gone through an alternative program, but 4 years of teaching experience, and they're not able to get here without going back to school because they don't have that 5th year. So I think it's both. We certainly can improve the production, if you will, at the OPI and the rate of evaluating. And also we need to take a look at what our requirements are to say, how do we ensure quality without so much redundancy in the rule and it not being so inequitable? Because currently the way it sits, there's an assumption there, you guys, that there's something different between a traditional and an alternative program, or something different between if you're prepared out of state versus in state. And so I just bring that forward to you. I think it's both of what you're talking about. And that the rules are really critical. There's pieces in there, you guys, with the pathway that say we have notaries that have to be filled out, university recommendations, transcripts. There's all these different components that folks must submit as document, as proof to what? It's some kind of quality measure. What are those measures? And are there more than one way to show that you have your pedagogy, that you have your content, and that you are the kind of teacher that we want in our schools? So I appreciate the conversation definitely about the staffing, and that's helpful. And I also want to kind of say, I want to come back to these different pathways and all these different things do in many ways are very cumbersome. There's lots of layers at times.
Julie, Sharon mentioned knowledge of some sort of a flow chart that made more sense of the pathways that OPI has. Are you aware of that?
Of course, Jacob.
Yeah. Is that
It's
something
on the website?
It is on the website? Okay.
Yes,
Tristan, could we
have a
get that in
couple
the
things.
chat?
We have, yeah, I can jump in the chat. I have to go. I'm kind of, Jacob, I'm in a corner of a hotel room.
Well,
so.
Tristan, maybe Tristan could do it for us if she knows where it is.
I tried to look and I cannot get the OPI website to actually open. I know we've had some technical errors today, or technical problems. I don't know, Kristen, maybe you'll have better luck.
If someone can direct me to where it's at, I can grab it.
I'll get it.
Go ahead, Sharon.
I'll tell you.
Oh, and thank you, Julie. It was me who mentioned that. And yeah, thank you, Julie, for finding that. And the only reason I know about that, of course, is because when I was chair of the Board of Public Ed, we saw many times through the folks who brought it as far as the Board of Public Ed, that form that indicated which piece they were missing. And it was a great flow chart form.
So we were efforting to get that to the group. That seems like a very useful tool to help us visualize everything that we've talked about. So we've had great discussion today. We may not leave with any quote unquote bullet points, but we've definitely made progress. I want to plant seeds, I guess, to move us into the next meeting and ask about the next meeting. So we were going to talk about endorsements today. So let me plant these seeds of areas within endorsement that we know are difficulties and or areas of consideration to think about in terms of teacher candidates. So one thing within Montana currently, that there are broad endorsement categories. So when I say broad, it's like K-8 versus having a specific middle school endorsement. And there are reasons and context for that, one of which is many of these state schools are rural and they therefore are K-8 schools. So having that broad endorsement makes it much easier to have a more flexible teacher within that school building. And that's useful. Now, what you could potentially run into then is with states who teachers who are coming from out of state. So I know we're talking about, this kind of licensure piece. So as we think about that moving forward and breaking down the barrier of being in-state or out of state, there's the consideration now of alignment of endorsements, right? So if I came from, just making this up, so nobody write this down. If I came from Wyoming and I was 6-8 certified and that endorsement did not align in Montana, then there is some level of difficulty to determine exactly how that would convey at this point. Okay, so as we think about moving forward in recommendations, there's that consideration around endorsement. One thing we've talked about previously is also that if a national board certified teacher comes and you're endorsed in a national board area, those endorsements do not line up. They have some specialty areas and they also have some grade level areas as well, but they're not directly aligned with what's in Montana. The other piece to consider is there is no middle school endorsement in Montana again. So that's just something that many other states have that Montana does not have. And then there's the process that Julie talked about of sort of advancing your licensure. And if you think about advancing in terms of adding an endorsement, currently in Montana, to add an endorsement requires additional coursework through a university system. Whereas many states, you can add endorsements to your license by simply passing the assessment that goes along with that endorsement. So this also ties into our conversation around praxis, because generally this would be some form of praxis test. But the example would be in Texas, I know for sure, I obtain a license as a K-2 elementary teacher. Once I've got that first license, no matter what it's in, I then can go get essentially an endorsement and or the ability to teach any other subject in the K-12 realm if I can go past that endorsement test, right? So I could be a K-2, this is a broad example, but I could be a K-2 certified teacher. That's my first license. Then I could go take a high school biology exam and get that endorsement and teach high school biology if I pass that exam. So there's, in other states, oftentimes much more flexibility to add those endorsements onto a license to be able to make yourself more flexible and have more, just more ability to teach within the K-12 school system in terms of endorsements. Sharon.
Okay, so to clarify that, and that was my question on when I looked at the chart about endorsements. You had a could consider allowing teachers that hold specific content area endorsements to teach out of their endorsement areas, particularly in rural schools. So let me raise this like to my level, maybe. I was a high school math teacher. I'm also endorsed in English. So under that argument, then are we maintaining that it's okay, maybe that we should relax that and then let me be able to be not just teach, but perhaps be assigned to teach science? Because if that's the case, I heartily disagree. I could maybe pass a science test after studying. I'm a pretty good test taker after studying that, whatever content area you're talking about, but I am in no way qualified to teach that science. I needed a degree for that. And that's what chapter 58 is probably about too.
So Sharon, your understanding is correct. I think it's important to note we are discussing an outlier case, most likely. Right? I mean, it's not necessarily, I think, the norm that someone would go on to teach science if they don't want to or aren't qualified to do it, but it could happen. That's the piece, right?
So I think that, Sharon, what you're bringing up is different among all three of these bullets, right? So when we talk about the first one, if you are an out-of-state teacher who has an endorsement to teach history, US history only, you can't get an endorsement for broad field social studies. You would have to go back to school to take some coursework to get that broad field social studies so that you could teach geography, economics, government, and such. So it kind of plays out different with that bullet, right?
Right, and I'm aware of that. And also the same is true of certain areas in science. And I am absolutely aware of the social studies one, because some of our social studies teachers are actually unable to teach US government because of what you're talking about. But I think we just have to be careful about how far we throw open that door.
I just wanted to share that it was different basically between 1, 2, and 3 of these bullet items, which you're mentioning.
Right, so our discussion that Sharon was in is really about the flexibility of adding endorsements within. Once you're licensed in Montana, then what does the process to add an endorsement look like? Currently, it requires additional coursework. Is that too restrictive? Is it not? Is it fine? Is sort of where we are. Philip.
Yeah, could you define many? What, do you have a number associated with that?
You said many?
Yeah, many states simply require passing a test. What is that?
I don't have a count on what that is specifically in terms of the 50 states. But we could certainly get that for the next meeting, or we will investigate getting that.
Thank you.
Any other last comments on this before we have a kind of look at where we are and then have a short discussion about our next meeting? Philip, did you have another comment?
Yeah, I did. Just one other thing. Maybe somebody in the department, Julie, could answer this. Really, how this got me to this Tiger team here. The question on why is Montana, okay. So my endorsements are in history and broad field social studies, and I was teaching industrial arts on a, just for a semester, and looked at maybe doing that longer. Okay. And started looking into the licensing aspect of that and what it would take, and certainly would require additional coursework, which I was considering, okay, going back to school. But then we came up, and this is the one sticking point that I just don't understand, is this aspect that in your lifetime, I guess, in the state of Montana, you can only get one provisional license, one class 5. And I just don't so you could still, okay, well, I can still teach shop while I'm taking these other classes, but you can't do that in Montana. So you would have to disconnect from that, finish up all that additional schoolwork, then, I guess get your regular, an additional endorsement in industrial arts. Could you why is that only one provisional per a lifetime, I guess?
So to answer your question, you can there's a couple of things beyond a provisional license. There's called internships. You could be adding an endorsement while teaching in the area you want to be endorsed in. For example, what you're bringing up, the industrial arts. And then you could do an internship. And then you have to, be going to school and have a university sign off on it, the superintendent of the district. And then you could go through an internship, meaning you're working with the college, but it's not a provisional license, if you will. But in order to qualify for an internship, you have to hold at least a class 2 license. You couldn't hold a provisional.
Sean?
Yeah, So the question is this, and I understand regarding endorsements that you could go ahead and go back to school, take some additional coursework to go ahead and be endorsed in a certain area. I just want to step back to my own primary field, which is the tech field. And you know, again, there are certain certifications that the person can go ahead and take, certification exams, Security Plus, Network Plus, so on and so on and so on. That really kind of endorses you to go ahead and work in a particular area. Now with that said, and I'm familiar with some aspects, and this is one of those areas I'm not familiar within. What are other states outside of the coursework? What do other states do, or are there other kinds of tests or alternative programs, if you will? And I'm not really sure what I mean about that. That will allow you to basically take a test to get an endorsement. And when I say take a test, I mean that really liberally. So you know, what is the process or other processes that you can go about to get an endorsement? You know, to teach something outside of your original endorsement area. Did that make sense? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, Sean, this is Julie. I'll answer your question. In other states, you can add an endorsement by taking an exam like the Praxis. In some, you can also do it through taking an exam and having years of experience of teaching that. So say you taught a section of science and you teach 4 sections of math. If you've done that for 3 years and then you pass the science exam, then you could add that endorsement without having to go through a formalized preparation program or back to the university.
Do we have those science exams, for instance? Do we have those within the state?
Those would be the Praxis.
Okay, so it's a content area, science, history, or whatever, that would be specific to going back and retaking the Praxis for that particular content area. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Sharon.
And I think we currently require a minor for that to happen. Is that correct, Julie? We require a minor in an endorsement area.
It depends on, Sharon, like the university, they would take a look at your coursework, and it depends on what their requirements are to for a candidate to get that endorsement. We don't like count numbers of credits and say it has to be a minor, if you will. It's all on the education preparation program for them to determine what they would require for an endorsement.
And another question, Julie, is follow up. Is there then, there's methods of teaching science, there's methods of teaching biology, methods, is that correct? Do you look for that too?
We do not look for any particular coursework, no, in terms of if it's like methodology courses and then like say biology class and then, you know, methodologies for teaching. We only look for a recommendation from a university for that endorsement.
Okay, that clarifies that. My question maybe is though then more for John.
Yeah, we have specific methods for different content areas.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's what I was looking for.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We're at the end of our time. We're on the calendar for the 12th and the 19th, as well as the 26th. We recognize that this is going to run into some schools starting, which could impact schedules. Given where we are now, if this causes difficulties, maybe let Crystal know, and we can look at making adjustments moving forward in terms of time, but we certainly need to meet and think about how we're going to move forward. In terms of the next meeting, I heard an ask from Angela that we did not get to put before the rest of the group, and that's some more information on the tiered licensing systems in other states. Does everybody think that would be helpful? Just a thumbs up real quick if you think that'd be helpful. We try to get that to you, and maybe we could look at that starting off the next meeting. Seeing all thumbs, people who have their calendars on. Okay, Diane, go ahead.
That was a thumbs up with a bad
Okay.
click.
Nope,
Thanks.
that's perfect. So yeah, so we will work to compile some information on that. I do know there is one report that exists that's pretty succinct and has some links to other states that have done it that are useful from the National Council on Teacher Quality. So we may be able to get it done with one piece of reading, and we'll get that to you before Monday. That will be useful. And then we'll start the next meeting by looking at that and digging into, I think, what our next steps in terms of format and process can be to make sure we can move along efficiently. Thank you, everybody. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up or right at the top of the hour? Thank you for the conversation. Again, I think we made a lot of progress today and moved us one step closer.
I just want to say thank you, Jacob, Eric, Julie, Crystal. Really just a great conversation today, and you folks have extraordinary patience in facilitating all of this good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, and we'll see everybody next week.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.